As a geopolitical analyst, I see ironies all the time. And in fact, this is one of the most enjoyable parts about my job, while also simultaneously being one of the most frustrating parts about my job, depending on the context. I see these ironies all the time, where things appear to be one way on the surface, but when you actually look deeper and you analyze the system as a whole and the second-order effects and things like that, things often actually turn out to be completely the opposite of what the surface-level expectations may imply. And this is, of course, dangerous, because when it comes to any kind of politics, especially probably geopolitics, most people only hear one side of the story, a surface-level narrative, and very few people actually look at the system as a whole. Geopolitics, when it comes to politics, are usually treated as a platform to spring off of to appeal to a particular base, where you talk about issues that may seem to be low stakes, and you aggravate people's opinions in one direction or the other. And your goal is not to arrive at the correct answers, but your goal is to move your political base in one direction or the other by simply adopting the opposite platform of whatever your opponent might adopt. Right now, I am currently observing one of these ironies in real time, where it has now become undeniably true that the average American has lost more money by not giving money to Ukraine than they would have by simply supporting Ukraine in a more thorough and a more meaningful way. And I get it. When I say that, that might at first sound like narrative spin, but I promise it's not. This is the result of system-level thinking, looking not just at the top-level effects, but looking at the downward effects and what happens, what are the consequences of a decision as it plays out across the geopolitical system as a whole. And right now we are witnessing how the average American is losing more money by not having voted to support Ukraine more in previous years than they would have if they had simply given Ukraine money, and that's playing out in a very specific way. It is playing out in the context currently of the energy war that started, the energy crisis that started when the United States declared war on Iran, and Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. And as a result of that energy war, there have now been other effects. One of the big ones is that Ukraine has started taking Russian energy infrastructure offline in a new way. Specifically, Russian export terminals, which have halted Russian exports, about 40% of Russian exports, presumably for the long term. Because Ukraine is not letting up on these strikes. And importantly, the United States and other partners have asked Ukraine to stop these strikes, but Ukraine has chosen to continue going forward anyways, for one simple reason. The United States no longer has leverage over Ukraine, because the United States made a decision to cut most support from Ukraine. It turns out that cutting that support from Ukraine causes Ukraine to think in a different way. It causes Ukraine to make decisions that they may not otherwise have made. And we can look at those decisions specifically and see that those decisions are now going to cost the average American, especially the average American consumer, far more than support for Ukraine ever would. What I'll demonstrate in this video is how, in a very easy to understand way, the increased price the average American consumer is going to have to pay for gasoline because of what's currently happening between Ukraine and Russia will cost them far more than supporting Ukraine ever would. But this is not the only aspect to this story. This is just the aspect that is the easiest to understand and the easiest to prove with actual hard numbers. But it turns out that it has been true in numerous ways that the war in Ukraine has cost the average American far more by not supporting Ukraine than support for Ukraine ever would have cost them. It has cost us far more in terms of our military spending and what that military spending is intended to prevent and intended to defend against. And it's also cost us far more in terms of how the way we've gone about supporting Ukraine or not supporting Ukraine has damaged our global relationships. These things are unquantifiable, but they're part of the bigger picture that are actually a bigger part than the increased gas prices. But when you view everything together, you realize that the system as a whole that we have disrupted by having internal political debates that only factored in one piece of the story has been extremely destructive. There's a lot to get into in this video, but first, just a quick word from the sponsor that made this analysis possible. Today's video is sponsored by Novium, creators of the Hover Pen, the coolest pen I have personally ever owned, and one of the best gift ideas I've seen in a long time. If you're like me, you do most of your writing digitally these days, but you might still appreciate the aesthetic and art of writing with a physical pen. And for me, that feeling is enhanced when the pen itself is beautiful and unique. There's something about holding a nice pen that for me actually enhances the thinking process. It helps me slow down and arrive at better, more accurate conclusions. And Novium's Hover Pen definitely fits that description. I have a couple of different ones. There's the Hover Pen Interstellar, a refillable ballpoint pen that is brought to a perfect tilt on my desk using a specifically designed magnetic base. It sits at a 23.5 degree angle, a nod to the Earth's axial tilt. I'm picky about what I put on my desk, and this is still one of the most beautiful things there. It's also extremely enjoyable to write with. Light, but balanced, and it feels great in my hand. I have it in black, but it's available in a range of colors. Space Black, Starlight Silver, Mars Magma, and Neptune Blue. And you can even build your hover pen embedded with a shard of a rare meteorite, making it even more special, as you literally touch something not of this world every time you jot down your best ideas. If you want to get even more creative, Novium also makes the Hover Pen Future, which you can use as a fountain pen or a rollerball pen with an interchangeable tip. When I research videos, I find myself increasingly with a Novium hover pen in my hand, either jotting down notes or spinning in its base on my desk while I contemplate ideas. If you enjoy aesthetics like that, do yourself a favor and pick up a Novium hover pen for yourself. Or pick one up as a special gift for a special intellectual, creative, or anyone in your life who you think would appreciate such a unique pen. You can get a special 15% discount when you purchase a hover pen using the code Warburg within the next 72 hours, or a 10% discount after that. Just click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. Novium offers free shipping to most countries, including North America, the UK, Europe, Australia, and more. So be sure to get yours today. So as we dive deeper, what I want to do next is I want to lay a foundation for what we're currently seeing coming out of Ukraine today. And I want to contrast that with what we saw in Ukraine earlier in their war efforts. And I want to explain how this is largely because of the changing US attitude towards supporting Ukraine. And once we see all of those pieces, we can compare the effects of what would have happened had we continued to support Ukraine with what we're seeing now. And that is where we can come to this very logical, very defensible position that the United States has lost far more money by removing support from Ukraine than that support ever would have cost us. And that foundation comes down to this. What we're seeing Ukraine doing today is striking Russian energy targets at scale. But that is something that we did not see from Ukraine earlier in the war, and there was a very specific reason for that. Early on in their war against Russia, Ukraine was very dependent on outside support. They were dependent on support from the United States and also from Europe. And very frankly, early on in the war, if Ukraine had not gotten that support, they would have lost their war against Russia. At that time, Ukraine did not have a large domestic weapons production industry. They didn't have a lot of weapons stockpiles, and they did not have homegrown capabilities, for example, to do long-range strikes against Russia in particular. That meant that Ukraine, if they wanted to continue receiving weapons from their Western partners, was subject to the rules that those Western partners set. And this actually dictated Ukraine's strategy to Ukraine's harm in many different ways. A big example is that early on in the war, Russia had aircraft parked very close to the Ukrainian border that Ukraine could very clearly and very easily see. These aircraft were within range where Ukraine could have destroyed them, but the problem was that Ukraine did not have permission from their Western partners to destroy those aircraft with the weapons that were being provided by their Western partners. This allowed Russia to have very destructive campaigns against Ukraine, where they could basically bomb Ukraine with abandon, and they could do a lot more missions because their aircraft were so close to the border. Similarly, what we saw was that Russia was able to accumulate massive amounts of soldiers to prepare for offensives around the Ukrainian border, because though Ukraine could see exactly what Russia was doing, they couldn't do anything about it without risking support from their Western partners. These offensives that Russia conducted were still unsuccessful, but they were probably a lot more successful than they would have been if Ukraine could have intervened when they could see exactly what Russia was doing. And it also meant that Russia didn't have to worry too much about concealing their intentions because they knew that they could show Ukraine exactly their hand. They could show Ukraine exactly what they were going to do, and Ukraine couldn't do anything about it. While on the flip side, because Russia, had no restrictions on what they could do against the Ukrainian military, if they wanted to do a large tactical move, they would have to do so with the element of surprise, and that limited their options. That was a big way that affected the way the war was conducted early on. But also a major way that the war was conducted early on had to do with energy. Early on, the United States explicitly forbid Ukraine from striking Russian energy infrastructure, and it didn't matter whether that was with their weapons or Ukraine's own weapons. And the implicit threat was that if you do this, we will take away support from you. And this was not just one political party or the other. This was the Biden administration, but it was also the Trump administration, and currently it is the Trump administration telling Ukraine that we do not want you attacking Russian energy infrastructure because that will increase global energy prices. And if global energy prices increase, something happens in American politics. People in the United States do not like to see gas price increases. A lot of people, potentially enough people to sway a vote in one way or the other, vote basically based on how gas prices are going leading up to the election. So there was a lot of pressure on Ukraine not to do things that would have been very beneficial to them, which would have taken Russia's ability to generate revenues largely offline and would have prevented Russia from feeding their war machine. Now today we see something very different, where the United States is still pressuring Ukraine with this same pressure, but Ukraine has finally decided we're not getting enough from the United States to do something that benefits them to keep their support coming. Ukraine is now in a position where they are willing to risk losing U.S. support because, frankly, U.S. support is no longer meaningful to them. That sets the stage for what we're currently seeing. Two things could have happened if the United States had continued giving meaningful support to Ukraine. The first is speculation, but a genuine possibility. The second is not speculation at all. The first is that if the U.S. had supported Ukraine much more thoroughly, Ukraine might have actually won their war against Russia by now. With more thorough U.S. support, Russia might have realized they're not going to win, which already they're not going to win, but it would have been a lot more clear. And perhaps there could have been peace terms between Ukraine and Russia by now, terms that would have allowed Russian energy to stay on the market. Because if Russia was not currently attacking Ukraine, Ukraine would have no incentive to be attacking Russia's energy infrastructure. Now, that's not provable, but the second thing is provable, which is that if the United States had continued their support for Ukraine, Ukraine probably would have not struck Russia's energy infrastructure, because that is how they behaved earlier in the war. Regardless, that's not what happened. Ukraine is striking Russian energy infrastructure, and that has a measurable impact on global energy prices. So with that in mind, let's measure that impact. And I'm going to do so with rough math here. If you want to, you can get more precise. There are more precise figures out there. But what you'll see is that the precise figures don't matter here because I'm not trying to get a specific number. I'm just trying to show proportional impacts. And these proportional impacts will be directionally accurate. So when we look at global energy prices right now, obviously those are up. And they are up mostly because of the war in Iran and what's happening with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But they are also up because of Ukraine taking Russian export capacity offline, and you could argue that they're doing that because of the war in Iran. But either way, global energy prices are up to the tune where the average American consumer on gasoline alone is spending something like an extra $35 to $45 per month. Now, for some people, it's much worse. This is the average across the entire population. It depends a lot on where you live, what kind of car you drive, how much gasoline you actually consume. You get the picture. But the average American consumer on gasoline is spending $35 to $45 extra dollars a month. And this is only the first part of the increased costs from higher gasoline. Obviously, higher gasoline prices increase the price of literally everything. And this is a little bit harder to analyze, but a lot of people would say the average American consumer, when you factor in everything, is probably spending at least a couple hundred extra bucks a month on gasoline prices. Let's be a little bit conservative. Let's call it $200 per month total, including gasoline and extra costs. Now, what proportion of that can be attributed to Ukraine shutting down Russian export capacity? So this is actually a relatively simple math equation. What we need to know is what percent of total global oil exports have actually been interrupted. And then we need to determine what percent of that comes from Russia. And that will let us know what percent of US consumer price increases can be attributed to Russia. So first we have to factor in the Strait of Hormuz. Through the Strait of Hormuz comes approximately 30 to 35% of global oil exports. People hear a 20% number. That is the percent of total global oil supply that goes through the Strait of Hormuz. The percent of global oil exports is 30 to 35%. That's the number I'll be using because then I can compare apples to apples. Now, Russia is responsible for about 10% to 15% of global oil exports. In this case, for easy math, let's just say that Russia is responsible for 10% of global oil exports, but because we rounded down, let's say that Ukraine has shut down 50% of their export capacity. Again, it's not precise, but it's really directionally pretty close. That lets us see that Ukraine has taken offline about 5% of global oil exports because of their attacks against Russia. While at the same time, let's just say 35% in the Strait of Hormuz, again, just for easy math, 35% has been shut down because the Strait of Hormuz has been shut down. So the total global oil exports that have been stopped is 40%. Of that 40%, 5% can be attributed to Ukraine's attacks against Russia. So if 5% of the total 40% shutdown can be attributed to Russia, that gives us a fraction, 5/40. Approximately 12.5% of the global oil price increases can be attributed to what Ukraine has done to Russia. Again, directional, not precise. That, when we compare to what the average US consumer is now spending an extra because of increased prices, $200. What is 12.5% of $200? And it turns out to be $25. The average American consumer is spending $25 extra every month at a minimum because of Ukraine taking Russia's oil industry offline. Now, that is not a huge figure. It's nothing to go into crisis mode about. But the reason I'm giving you this number is to compare it to another number, which is just as important, which is what is the number that the average American would have spent if they had supported Ukraine more? And what you'll see here is that the numbers dwarf each other out. In a previous video, I actually did the math on how much the war in Ukraine cost the average American citizen. And I did that by calculating the total amount of military funding the United States had provided to Ukraine and dividing that up among every American citizen. The figure was about $70 billion, that's how much aid we provided, divided by 345 million American citizens. And when we do that, we arrive at a monthly figure of something around $6 per citizen per month to provide Ukraine with military aid. Now, to provide Ukraine a proper amount of military aid would obviously be a larger figure than that. It might be $12, it might be $18, because you might want to have provided double or triple what we actually provided. But what you see is that figure per American citizen is a lot lower than the figure per American citizen, the $25 figure that we're currently spending on increased energy just from this one factor. What we realize is that already Americans are paying more money per month on increased energy from not supporting Ukraine than they would have paid if they provided Ukraine with a lot of support. And of course, the elephant in the room here is that obviously providing Ukraine with more support wouldn't have just saved us money, but it would have saved Ukrainian lives, and it would have saved Ukrainian cities, and there would have been a lot of other benefits on top of that, where you would have had lives preserved instead of infrastructure in Russia destroyed. And that's also a massive factor. So on the surface, we can already see how supporting Ukraine is clearly the better financial decision. But we've only looked at the surface. And as we go many, many more levels deep, we'll realize it actually becomes much, much clearer. So first, let's look at that $70 billion figure, because it's actually not a very honest figure. It's very over-exaggerated, and where this figure came from was the replacement cost for the equipment that the United States sent to Ukraine, not the actual dollar value of what we sent to Ukraine. So let me explain. When the United States sent military aid to Ukraine, the vast majority of that was not brand new equipment. The vast majority of what was sent to Ukraine was military equipment that, under standard and normal practices, we were already in the process of decommissioning. We would have actually had to pay to salvage and scrap that equipment, and instead of paying and salvaging to salvage and scrap it, we paid to ship it to Ukraine and gave it to them instead. When we replaced that equipment that we were already going to salvage and scrap or have sit in a yard somewhere, that replacement equipment had a cost, and the cost of that replacement equipment is often what was figured in to what we were giving to Ukraine. So it was a highly inflated figure to begin with, and it was probably twice, maybe in some cases 3 times the value of what was actually provided to Ukraine. But it gets even worse, because just because we gave that aid to Ukraine doesn't mean it all just disappeared from America's pockets. Because the people who were getting paid to replace the equipment that we were giving to Ukraine, of course, were American businesses, American contractors. This was money that was going into their pockets that was then paying taxes or being used to pay salaries of people who paid taxes. You get the picture. So a huge portion of what we gave to Ukraine wasn't actually given to Ukraine. It was just money that was spent in our economy. And the only thing that was really given to Ukraine was the raw costs, for example, of those materials, but certainly not the entire number. It makes the whole figure just get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that $6 figure that it costs the average American $6 per month to provide aid to Ukraine, if we're being conservative, it was probably actually closer to a real cost of $3 to $4 per month, which of course is dwarfed by that $25 figure that we saw when it came to gasoline prices. Now, gasoline prices also benefit American industry because obviously when we buy gas, that pays American producers, and that puts profits and taxes back into the American economy. So we do have to compare apples to apples to be fair. But in either case, the benefit is obvious. This, though, is still only part of the story, because we have to realize that we got a benefit from what we spent in Ukraine. It wasn't just money down the drain. And the benefit that the United States got from spending money in Ukraine is they actually effectively got to reduce their own military spending if they wanted to. And they got to do so without sacrificing American lives. They got to reduce their military spending. They got to test their military technology in a real theater of war with Ukrainians sacrificing their lives, not American soldiers. And what you have to really look at is the number that the United States spends on an annual basis to protect itself, which on average, as the war in Ukraine has gone on, has been over $800 billion up to $900 billion. Let's just say $850 billion per year. Just again, rough napkin math. And currently, the US military is looking to spend $1.5 trillion per year. And what is that budget for? Well, of course, that budget is largely to protect us against Russia. Who knows what percentage of that budget is to protect against Russia? Let's just be conservative. Let's say it's 25% of $800 billion. Let's just say it is, what is that number? $200 billion per year that we spend as a country countering Russia, compared to $70 billion that we gave Ukraine total over a period of 3 years, which again wasn't even $70 billion. Ukraine, for a very low cost, has defeated an enemy that we are selling out literally hundreds of billions of dollars every single year to counter. And that just doesn't factor into most people's equations, but it really should. And it does bring to mind the question, is this conversation, this political conversation that we're hearing, is it really being honest? Are people really upset that we're spending so much money on Ukraine? Or are there lobbyists involved who realize that because Ukraine is defeating Russia for such a low cost, that is taking away potentially hundreds of billions of dollars of profits from them if people realize that what the US military spends is excessive compared to the value that the American people actually get out of that. Indeed, compared to the $6 per month that the average American spends on Ukraine, the average American spends about $200 per month supporting the US military. And again, the numbers just dwarf each other. And you realize that the money that is spent on the war in Ukraine isn't actually really money that's being spent. It's not money that we're throwing away, but it's potentially the largest bargain the American people have ever been presented with. But we're still not done, because there is yet another cost that the United States has had to incur by withdrawing support from Ukraine. And this is an unquantifiable cost, but it is almost certainly the biggest cost of them all. And that is the cost of global trust, where the United States has built up its reputation as the most powerful country in the world that has allowed us to become the most prosperous nation in human history, largely because of how we use our military to protect other countries. It's a complex global system, but the United States benefits because we have reserve currency status. Every country wants to trade with us, largely because we protect them. And it is part of the implicit, if not explicit, agreement that we have with many different countries. This global trade has now been disrupted in a major way because a lot of other countries, fairly or not, simply do not trust us anymore, not just because we withdrew support from Ukraine, but because of the manner in which we withdrew that support, where we had already allocated things and then we took those things away, and people realized, well, we can't actually trust them when they've promised things to us. That gets people less willing to participate in the global system we've created that benefits nobody more than it benefits us. So what do we learn from all of this? That political debates are often one-sided? Absolutely. And we also learn that when establishing and evaluating the cost of something, the cost of a political decision, we have to look at not just the upfront cost, but we also have to put that upfront cost in context. And even more than that, we have to look at the value that we get from paying that cost. I've used this analogy a lot, but every functioning business knows that they have to have operating costs to generate profits. For the US global system, the geopolitical system that we've created, it's much the same. We get a lot of benefits by having a reserve currency, by being the dominant trader in a system that is fabulously wealthy. To remain at the top of that system, there are some operating costs. But if we focus more on the operating costs than we focus on how much the system actually benefits us, we're in for a lot of hurt. In the case of Ukraine, we focused more on the operating costs of providing military aid than we did on the benefits that we got from providing that aid to Ukraine. And even just on a surface level, just looking at oil prices, we can see how much we've lost. But in reality, that is just the tip of the iceberg. I hope you've learned a lot in this video. I hope you found this discussion to be balanced and fair, pointing out things from all sides of the fence, bringing data together to arrive at a more accurate conclusion, not just the conclusion that is most convenient for whatever my political side of the fence happens to be. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out one of these videos on screen for more from me. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.